Okay, Moby Dick, Chapter 1. So, not only am I going to analyze Chapter 1 here, but I'm going to kind of explain how this analysis is going to run. I'm basically going to assume that you read the chapter, you understand the basic plot, if not every single allusion or fact in here, and then I have three color coded pieces of analysis, and I'll use the first three passages I marked, or maybe the first four or five, to demonstrate what the differences are. So, first passage. The opening line, call me Ishmael. We talked about in class the notion that this seems to call the reader's attention to a self-awareness of the text that is particularly striking for 1851, that a text would be using language which requires the self-awareness of an interlocutor, of someone to talk to, rather than saying, my name is Ishmael, call me Ishmael, seems to force the reader to acknowledge the fact that the text is aware that it has a reader. This is why this line is so famous. It's stunning for a work from 1851 to be so metatextual at a time when those discussions were really not happening, when realist fiction, which tried to assert its veracity at all times, was pretty popular. So why is it highlighted in yellow? So this is going to be difficult to explain, but I hope you'll notice the pattern. I've highlighted passages in yellow that I think are explicitly interested in one of Moby Dick's most frequently occurring ideas. I'm not going to say its main idea. I mean, people have been arguing about what the main idea of this book is for 150 years, 170 to be more precise. But certainly one of the issues that comes up in Moby Dick a lot is knowledge, and the limitations of knowledge, and the scope of knowledge. What can we know? How do we know things? What conclusions can we make based on that knowledge? What is the experiential understanding of knowledge? What is the logical understanding of knowledge? What is the spiritual scope of our knowledge? And so here, knowledge is at play, but it's kind of in a literary or textual sense. What do we know about Ishmael? Is Ishmael his real name, etc., etc.? I would also be shortchanging the chapter to not address the question of Ishmael's etymology in terms of the name, which is obviously a reference to Abraham's first son by Hagar, who is considered an outcast by the Judeo-Christian tradition, but is considered one of the fathers of the Islamic tradition. So this seems to place Ishmael as some kind of outsider, or some kind of person who doesn't necessarily belong, but is connected with the world. And that's going to be the position he takes in a lot of the book, is to be this outside observer who is connected with the events that are happening, but doesn't seem particularly active in his participation, just like Ishmael might not be a particularly active character in the Judeo-Christian mythological framework. Okay, then we get to the first paragraph. Again, I'm assuming you read this, so I'm just going to summarize real briefly what's in orange. That through a lot of figurative imagery, we learn that Ishmael goes to the ocean when he is feeling suicidal or depressed. There's lots of great figurative images here. The stopping himself from knocking other people's hats off, the staring at coffin warehouses, the comparison to Cato, the famous Roman orator who killed himself. I highlighted this in orange, and I'm using this more as a demonstration. I highlighted this in orange because I don't think any reader who's taking this book seriously could not find this passage interesting. So if yellow means figurative, orange means interesting, which of course, obviously usually has something to do with being figurative as well. It has some relationship to an idea or concept, but it's an idea or concept that very frequently, I think you'll find if you keep watching these lectures, Melville will say something very interesting about a topic and it will not reoccur for a long, long time. Or if it does reoccur, it's not necessarily in the same way. So I'm charting a big main idea in terms of knowledge and understanding and truth and access to knowledge in yellow. But these other very interesting passages that I don't want to skip over because I can't necessarily categorize them yet, I'm putting in orange to clearly demonstrate that I think they're interesting or important, but that the pattern that they draw is a little less obvious and a little less tied together than the yellow passages. So if yellow is figurative, orange is interesting. Okay, and what's interesting about this is not Ishmael's initial emotional state before he goes onto the boat, I mean, that's interesting for sure, but the last lines are what are provocative, where he says, "There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree sometime or other cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me." So, two things. Does he mean that most people view the ocean as having the same ability to create a new start or a radical break from previous experience? That is why he figuratively compares the journey to the ocean to suicide, right? They're both complete breaks with the past. Life on the sea will be nothing like his former life. But also, he might be saying that the people see the ocean as that break, but that doesn't seem particularly correct, right? Like, maybe in 1851 it was true, but it would be a bold claim of Melville to say that all men desire to go on the ocean, right? I think it makes more sense to interpret this a little non-textually, because he says feelings towards the ocean, but I think it's that Melville is saying most men have felt the need for a radical change in their life, or some desire to end, not their physical life, but figuratively end some part of their life and make a radical change, whether it's the typical adolescent progression towards attending college and leaving their hometown, or it's changing careers, or it's dating a new person, or take your pick of serious radical change. I think that would make more sense to me than the notion that the ocean is the solution to all those people's problems, which is a less interesting interpretation. So I like to interpret this passage as talking about the universality of the cause of Ishmael's need to go on the Pequod, as opposed to the effect of Ishmael's journey towards the ocean. Okay, moving on. Here's a yellow passage. At this point, Ishmael has been talking about the constant need of people for water, of the desire for water. And he's talking about how if you're in a land of, some high land of lakes, if the best part of that land is the stream. And I just like this phrase. I mean, it's so clearly figurative. Yes, as everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. A provocative claim, right? Like, why do human beings tend to meditate when water is around? Well, I'm going to pause here and just connect this to the next passage, which kind of gives an argument for why that's true. So here, once again, this is highlighted in yellow, which is telling you that this passage has something to do with knowledge or truth or meaning. And we'll start with the line, why? Why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a healthy, robust soul in him at some time or other crazy to go to sea? Why, upon your first voyage as a passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity? Obviously, he's talking about Poseidon, an own brother of Jove. Poseidon is a brother of Zeus. Jove is a, anglicized, I don't know if anglicized, but it's a, Christianized way of referring to some syncretic blend between Zeus and God. Surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. Okay, whenever the author says this is the key to it all, you know that they're making some kind of important figurative point. The first half of the passage obviously draws on the ubiquity of the importance of water across generations and different civilizations in order to build up his point that water is important, but it's not until the last line where we see the explicit argument about knowledge here coming from Melville, which is that we're so interested in water because just as it is ungraspable in terms of our physical existence within the world of water, i.e. like human beings are very adapted to land, but you drop them in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, they're going to be very upset, they're going to be very unprepared. So too are we so interested in water because according to Melville, it is an image, it captures that ungraspability of life. So here, ungraspability does not mean necessarily physical ungraspability. Obviously, we can physically touch lots of aspects of life. But the ungraspable aspect of life he's talking about is that of knowing or understanding life. Answering the big questions like why? Why does the world work certain ways? Why do certain things happen to certain people? What are people thinking? How do we understand them? All of these issues are going to be treated with more specificity and more development as we move further into the text. But this is a great setup in chapter 1 for this really important idea that the journey of the Pequod is the journey into a world of restricted or impeded knowledge that will continually come up again and again. So now we get to the third type of highlighting I'm going to use in this text, which is blue. And I think you'll know what blue is for if I just read this passage that I'm referring to in chapter 1. Ishmael is talking about how he's going to travel on the Pequod, and he says, "And as for going as cook, though I confess there is considerable glory in that, a cook being a sort of officer on shipboard, yet somehow I never fancied broiling fowls. Though once broiled, judiciously buttered, and judgmatically salted and peppered, there is no one who will speak more respectfully, not to say reverentially, of a broiled fowl than I will. It is out of the idolatrous dotings of the old Egyptians upon broiled ibis and roasted river horse that you see the mummies of those creatures in their huge bakehouses, the pyramids." So obviously I'm using blue here to talk about humor, just throughout this book. I mean, Melville is so funny. And especially if you find the juxtaposition of content and language hilarious, well, there's no better passage to demonstrate than this one in chapter 1, where he manages to talk about cooking chickens or other birds with words like judiciously buttered, judgmatically salted, speaking reverentially, idolatrous dotings of the old Egyptians. I mean, he makes a joke here. Not only is he saying, yeah, if you cook birds right, they taste good, but in a very fancy way, which I find the contrast humorous. Then he says that because the Egyptians loved eating delicious cooked chicken so much that they modeled themselves after a chicken cooking in an oven by putting themselves as mummies in the pyramids. I mean, it's kooky, it's hilarious, it's absurd, and it's Melville, and I love that stuff. So that stuff's going to be in blue. So now that we've had that kind of introduction, I'm going to start moving a bit faster. And then we'll skip down 2 paragraphs, and then we get to another orange passage. And when you see this orange, like I said, you should know, okay, this is an important or interesting passage, but remember that word interesting, but maybe doesn't fit into the obvious knowledge, truth, meaning triangle that yellow would deal with. Oh, and by the way, I forgot the acronym for blue. So we've got yellow is F for figurative, orange is I for interesting, and then we go back to F for funny. Okay, figurative, interesting, funny. All right, so here we have the interesting passage about who ain't a slave. Tell me that. Well then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that all is right, that it is all right, that everybody else is in one way or other served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view. That is, and so the universal thump is passed around, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. That's a hell of a passage. I mean, it kind of can be summarized with the line, who ain't a slave? And obviously this isn't actually about, I mean, maybe it is about interpersonal relationships, but that line, universal thump and metaphysical point of view, seems to divorce this notion of a cycle of violence or a cycle of ill treatment away from purely human interactions to start talking about the world itself being full of a cycle of violence and a cycle of poor treatment. I assume you could take this in many different directions. You could talk about the hostility of nature towards human beings, i.e. the fact that, like, no matter how advanced our civilization is, if you go out into the wilderness without any preparation, like, the jungle will try to kill you. You could talk about the human-human relationship. You could talk about how various human civilizations, or within a civilization, various humans try to hurt each other and treat life as a zero-sum game. And then, of course, I think the universal thump that is metaphysical is the hostility of time towards human experience, that everyone will get thumped and punched, if not by a human being, and if not by their circumstances, by time itself, that waits for no man, if you will. So that's seemingly the problem. I don't know about problem, more like fact, that Ishmael is pointing out here. who ain't a slave to something, right? I guess if you want to quote Qui-Gon Jinn, there's always a bigger fish. And then another interesting aspect of the passage is that not only is that established, but then there's a solution offered in all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. Many scholars, including my professors when they taught me this book, will talk about Moby Dick's interest in the notion of sympathy. And that's a word being used in a particular 19th century context, which is to say that an ethical imperative or obligation in the face of the suffering or difficulty of the world is to simply be kind to your fellow man as empathetically and as humanly as you can. And this seems to be a passage which is explicitly advocating for sympathy as a response to the difficulty or harshness of the world or society. We'll see. I think that idea will come up in multiple passages throughout the text, but right here in a classic Melville fashion, it's kind of just a one-off. He throws it out and then moves on. Next passage we talk about in yellow is deals with the motivation to go on the boat being a passenger or a sailor. And I have it highlighted. The act of paying is perhaps the most uncomfortable affliction that the two orchard thieves entailed upon us. A wonderful way of referring to Adam and Eve. I find that hilarious. But being paid, what will compare with it? The urbane activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah, how cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition. So there's really two levels here that deal with truth and knowledge and meaning. First, I just want to clarify, if you're like, what do you mean on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven? You should check the gospel, the classic lines. If you want to follow me, give up all your possessions, right? And then the classic, which I love, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the gates of my Father's kingdom. So how does this deal with knowledge and truth and those ideas? Well, the first level is obviously about the relevance of subjective perspective. So the same action, the exchange of money, is different depending on what side of the exchange you're on. If you're the payer, it's horrible. If you're getting paid, it's wonderful. So obviously that deals with the notion that the experience or knowledge of an event changes its desirability or its morals or its importance to human beings. We do not all experience all events from the same perspective. In fact, we can shift across perspectives simply in terms of who we're dealing with at a given time. The second level of knowledge and truth here is about how abstract knowledge might not imply action on a concrete level. Obviously, that comes down to this notion that even though all of these Christian people who think that receiving money is dope should not think that it's great based on their Christian belief, but still do it. So I think it's an interesting observation by Ishmael, or Melville, whoever you want to say, that human beings' knowledge in the abstract does not necessarily imply anything for their concrete actions, which is a fascinating and irrational and illogical aspect of how people come to various truth claims about ethics in their life. If you try to logically debate a logical contradiction, you're going to have a problem. Okay, back to blue. A little light. That was heavy. Let's talk about a little lightness. He says, in this world, headwinds are far more prevalent than winds from a stern. That is, if you never violate the Pythagorean maxim. So we still use the term headwinds and tailwinds to this day. Headwinds are something which impede progress. Like if you bought a stock and there's something bad happening to the company, they'll be described as headwinds, right? Because they are winds that impede the direction of the boat. Whereas tailwinds or winds from astern help the situation, right? So Ishmael, in a little pessimistic observation, says that, a lot of things will try to make your job harder and few things will make your job easier. And what is the only time when winds from astern, and this is a play on words, will be more prevalent? That's if you violate the Pythagorean maxim. I had to look this up. What is the Pythagorean maxim? Well, apparently in some text that he writes, Pythagoras gives an advice never to eat beans. Yes, this is the fanciest farting joke that you will find in a 19th century American text. So if you want winds from astern, violate the Pythagorean maxim. Good stuff. And then we end on a yellow passage, so back to that main figurative idea, where Ishmael is still caught on this notion of why is he going to the ship? Like, what is the reason? How does he understand the reason for his journey into the ocean? He says, I think I can see a little into the springs and motives which, being cunningly presented to me under various disguises, induced me to set about performing the part I did, besides cajoling me into the delusion that it was a choice resulting from my own unbiased free will and discriminating judgment. So, fate and free will are obviously something interesting to evoke in the context of knowledge, because that's kind of at the basis of, well, I won't say the basis of, it is included within the set. So imagine a set of all things you can know, and there are multiple sets within that set. So it's very easy to know factual observational claims like my banana is yellow, or my wallet is brown, or things that we self-define to be true, like 2 + 2 = 4. Those are in the easy sets of knowledge. But assume that there is a set at the most difficult end of that set, which is things that are difficult to know. And obviously something that would be very far into that set would be the notion of fate and free will. It's just pretty much impossible to empirically observe. It's just something that has to be decided based on one's metaphysical ponderings about the nature of the universe. So I find it very interesting that Ishmael makes such a strong claim about the notion of fate here. He asserts with great confidence that at the time he felt his decision to join the Pequod was a choice, but he also says that he was fated to do it. We'll see how his knowledge or understanding of fate and free will evolve, but I think this passage forces the reader to confront a very difficult knowledge question already by chapter 1. Okay, and finally, the second to last paragraph. Chief among these motives was the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused all my curiosity. Then the wild and distant seas, where he rolled his island bulk, the undeliverable, nameless perils of the whale. These, with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds, helped to sway me to my wish. With other men, perhaps, such things would not have been inducements. But as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror and could still be social with it, would they let me in, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with the inmates of the place one lodges in. So, I think the connection here to knowledge and truth is fairly obvious. We have an explicit statement from Ishmael that the whale seems to represent these unknowable aspects of the world. It is mysterious. It is undeliverable. It is nameless. When Ishmael says that he has an itch for things remote, yes, that is the physical remoteness of the ocean, but it's also the epistemic or truth remoteness of the world. He wants to penetrate into those places where knowledge is circumscribed and limited and restricted and impeded by human knowledge. And the whale and the deep ocean are both two great, wonderful images of that forbidden or difficult, remote knowledge that Ishmael is interested in. And we'll see whether he gets it or not as he journeys with the Pequod.